Hello, my name is Lynn, and for most of my life, my parents called me the hopeless one. They bragged about my brother, praised him in front of everyone, while pretending I was invisible. They even threw a party at a vineyard, laughing behind my back, never realizing the vineyard belonged to me. But worse than the insults was the quiet betrayal. The years they drained my trust, my savings, my heart. How far would family go to tear you down, just because they never believed you could rise? The late afternoon sun cast a soft golden haze over the vineyard, stretching shadows across the manicured rows of vines. I stood near the edge of the gravel parking lot, watching as the family trickled in, oblivious to the fact that every stone, every leaf in this place belonged to me. Frank, my father, stepped out of his silver SUV first, smoothing his thinning hair and adjusting his sunglasses as if he were about to walk a red carpet. Claudine, my mother, followed right behind, fanning herself dramatically even though it wasn't that hot. And then there was Dorian, my younger brother, practically glowing with self-satisfaction, dressed like he had just walked out of a business magazine shoot. They didn't notice me right away. They were too busy marveling at the place, making comments loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Now this," Frank said, slapping Dorian on the back. "This is class. Only the best for my son's birthday, huh?" Claudine let out one of her theatrical sighs. "Just imagine, Dorian," she cooed. "One day you'll have a place like this under your name, not some whatever it is your sister's doing." I smiled tightly and approached, smoothing the front of my sundress. No one offered a greeting. No one even made eye contact. I wasn't surprised. The party was already buzzing. Long tables had been set with crisp white cloths, bottles of wine lined up like soldiers, and a massive cake with Dorian's face airbrushed on it stood at the center of attention. Photos of Dorian, childhood, graduation, faux-candid shots in tailored suits were scattered everywhere. My name, my face, nowhere to be seen. I grabbed a glass of water from the service table, choosing to stay back, half listening as Claudine played hostess. "Isn't Dorian just the golden child?" she gushed to an older couple from the neighborhood. "We always knew he'd make something of himself. Not everyone has the ambition, you know. Some are better suited to simpler lives." Her eyes flickered toward me. A calculated glance, a loaded smile. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. I wanted to respond. God, how badly I wanted to. But I forced myself to smile politely and moved closer to the rows of grapevines, letting the conversation wash over me like acid rain. The speeches began an hour later, after everyone had had enough wine to pretend the tension wasn't thick enough to cut with a knife. Frank cleared his throat loudly and tapped his glass with a butter knife. "If I could have your attention," he bellowed, "I'd like to say a few words about my son." I stood frozen at the edge of the group, my hands clasped so tightly behind my back that my knuckles ached. "Dorian's ambition, his drive, well, it makes a father proud," Frank continued, voice booming over the crowd. "He's a man who knows how to get things done. Not everyone can say that about their kids." Another sideways glance at me, like a punch thrown with a silk glove. Polite claps scattered through the crowd. A few awkward smiles. No one knew where to look. I kept my head high, my smile just a hair's breadth from cracking. My chest burned with humiliation, but I didn't move. I refused to give them the satisfaction. The evening sunlight deepened into a soft amber glow, the air cooling slightly. Servers bustled about, offering canapés and refilling champagne flutes. Conversations hummed, glasses clinked, a picture-perfect celebration if you ignored the undertones of cruelty lacing every other word my parents spoke. A sharp, familiar ache pressed against my ribs. A memory resurfacing. How many birthdays, graduations, milestones had I stood just like this, on the sidelines, smiling through the ache, pretending it didn't matter? It mattered. Frank raised his glass one final time. "Here's to a future we can all believe in," he said. His meaning was clear. A future without dead weight, without me. I watched the others raise their glasses, their faces a blur of forced celebration. I set my own glass down, untouched, and took a slow breath. For now, I chose silence. Not because I was defeated, but because I was planning. Because somewhere deep inside, a small voice, a voice that had been ignored for too long, whispered clearly, "Not this time." The glass still sat abandoned on the edge of the long table, catching the last bit of light like a forgotten promise. I stepped away from the crowd, each footfall deliberate, weaving between pockets of laughter that didn't quite reach the eyes. My chest was tight, not from the wine I hadn't touched, but from the unbearable weight of pretending. Near the far edge of the vineyard, where the vines thickened and the noise of the party thinned into a muted hum, I raised my phone to my ear. The screen was dark. I wasn't calling anyone. I just needed an excuse to be alone for 5 minutes without having to explain myself. The breeze shifted slightly, bringing with it the scent of earth and ripe grapes. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me, trying to steady the tremor that had taken root in my hands. Behind me, faint but still clear, I caught snippets of my mother's voice. "Honestly," Claudine said with a sugar-sweet lilt that never fooled me, "not everyone's cut out to succeed. Some people are better off marrying well, finding a nice, stable husband, settling down instead of whatever it is Lynn thinks she's doing." A few women tittered awkwardly. No one corrected her. No one defended me. The words didn't hit like a slap anymore. No, they sank deeper, settling into old wounds that never quite healed, no matter how thick a skin I thought I had built. The breeze carried me backward in time, whether I wanted it to or not. I was 16 again, standing in our cramped kitchen, clutching a sketch pad full of designs I had poured my heart into. Frank barely glanced at it before muttering, "Dreams are fine, but real life needs something sturdier than crayons and pipe dreams." Claudine had simply smiled, that same brittle smile, and said, "Maybe focus less on silly drawings and more on finding someone to take care of you, sweetheart." It had been the same song and dance through my early 20s. When Dorian flunked out of his second job, after wrecking my father's old truck and racking up debts he couldn't explain, it was me who emptied my savings to cover the costs. They hadn't even said thank you. Frank had just clapped Dorian on the back and told him, "Everyone makes mistakes, son. You'll bounce back." Mistakes, it seemed, were only forgivable if you were the right child. My phone buzzed uselessly in my hand, jarring me back to the present. I slid it into my purse and turned around just as Frank's voice rose above the party noise. "Let's all raise a glass," he bellowed, holding his champagne high, "to Dorian, the pride of this family. Thank God we have him, or who knows where we'd be." A ripple of laughter passed through the guests, some genuine, some strained. I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten. I could practically hear the unsaid words underneath. Thank God we don't have to rely on Lynn. My mother beamed up at Frank like he had just delivered a state address. Dorian laughed and tipped his glass at the crowd, his Rolex catching the setting sun. I forced a smile, a tiny, paper-thin thing. Inside, something sharp and electric was stirring, something that wasn't sadness. Not anymore. For so long I had internalized every slight, every whispered doubt, every backhanded compliment. I had worn their condescension like a second skin, pretending it didn't weigh me down. Tonight, though, something was cracking. The woman they thought they were mocking, the hopeless one, the dreamer, was standing on her own land, her own success hidden just beneath their arrogant noses. The thought should have made me feel triumphant. Instead, it made me sad. Sad for the years I had wasted trying to earn a love that was always conditional. Sad for the young woman who had believed their validation was something worth chasing. Frank laughed again, a booming, careless sound that made my stomach knot. I didn't need their approval. I didn't even want it. I glanced back toward the main courtyard where guests were milling, laughing, pretending not to notice the sharp barbs my parents kept throwing. The fairy lights strung overhead flickered on as twilight fell, casting a soft golden glow over the vineyard. And somewhere between my father's words and the clinking of glasses, a new truth settled deep in my bones. I would never let them define my worth again. The laughter around the courtyard carried on, but I no longer let it tether me. Instead, I drifted toward one of the side tables, pretending to adjust a centerpiece. It gave me a moment to steady the pulse roaring in my ears. The fairy lights above twinkled faintly now against the deepening twilight, casting halos around the guests. As I tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, a young vineyard employee approached, balancing a tray of wine glasses. His khaki uniform was crisp, and his cheeks flushed slightly as he noticed me standing alone. "Good evening, Miss Sharp," he said warmly, offering me a glass with a small respectful nod. Time froze. The words were innocent, casual even, but they crashed into the fabricated world my parents had built like a hammer through stained glass. Frank stiffened mid-sentence, his laugh dying in his throat. Claudine's eyes snapped to mine, wide with sudden suspicion. Dorian, clutching a half-eaten canapé, stared at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't know existed until now. I accepted the glass smoothly, giving the employee a polite nod of thanks. Poor kid. He had no idea he'd just pulled the first thread that would unravel everything. Conversations faltered nearby. Someone coughed awkwardly. The tension around our table sharpened, slicing through the festive pretense like a scalpel. Frank recovered first, forcing a hearty laugh that rang just a touch too loud. "Miss Sharp, huh? Looks like we got some VIP treatment tonight, eh?" Claudine chimed in, her voice brittle. "Well, of course, we do have connections. Family ties run deep, don't they, darling?" She leaned over and patted Dorian's arm like he was some visiting dignitary. I said nothing. I simply sipped my wine, savoring the taste, dry, bold, sophisticated, nothing like the cloying sweetness of their lies. Frank flagged down another server, puffing up his chest. "We'd love to meet the owner. Ought to thank him properly for putting together such a fine evening." Claudine gave me a pointed look, eyebrows raised. "You'll introduce us, won't you, sweetheart? I mean, you must know someone here to even get invited." The bait hung there between us, shimmering. I could have dragged it out, let them twist in the wind a little longer, but a lifetime of swallowing their condescension had sharpened my instincts, and tonight I was done playing. I set my glass down carefully, letting the faint clink ring out like a bell announcing a new hour. Then, with a calm that felt almost surgical, I turned to face them fully. "You're looking at her," I said simply. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Frank's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Claudine blinked rapidly, as if trying to clear fogged-up glasses. Dorian gawked, his hand still frozen mid-air with a half-eaten canapé. Around us, the buzz of conversation died a slow death. People turned subtly, curiosity sharpening their expressions as the tension became impossible to ignore. A fork clattered onto a plate somewhere behind me. I straightened my shoulders, feeling the weight of years slide off like a too-heavy coat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Every word hit like a gavel pounding a courtroom bench. "I own this vineyard," I continued, voice steady. "Every vine, every barrel, every bottle you toasted with tonight. It's mine." For a moment, there was only silence, thick and suffocating. Then a nervous laugh bubbled out of Frank, a brittle, cracking sound. "Come on, Lynn, don't joke about serious things. We're talking real business here, not your hobbies." Claudine forced a smile, reaching for the lifeboat he had thrown. "Yes, dear. It's lovely you're working here, or volunteering, or whatever it is." I didn't blink. "I own it," I repeated. "I bought this land 3 years ago, built the business from scratch, while you were busy telling everyone how hopeless I was." Frank's face purpled. Claudine's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Dorian, ever the golden boy, looked genuinely lost for once, a fish flapping on dry land. "You must be confused," Frank finally managed, voice tight. "No bank would give you that kind of loan without—" "Without what?" I cut in smoothly. "Without Dorian co-signing? Without you approving? Without someone holding my hand?" He blustered, searching for a foothold that wasn't there. "It's true," I said. "You never saw me, never believed in me, but it didn't stop me. It built me." I could feel the shift now, the crackle of energy changing direction. For the first time, it wasn't me shrinking under their scrutiny. It was them, exposed and scrambling. All around us, guests whispered behind napkins, through side glances they didn't bother to hide. I let the silence stretch a heartbeat longer, savoring it. And then, with a calm smile that tasted sweeter than any revenge could ever hope to be, I picked up my wineglass again and took a slow, deliberate sip. In that stunned silence, I realized the real celebration had just begun, and it was mine. The applause that never quite started died quickly. A brittle silence hung over the courtyard like a heavy mist. People avoided looking directly at me, choosing instead to glance at each other, uncertain whether to offer congratulations or condolences. It was almost comical, this sudden discomfort at a celebration they had orchestrated without ever thinking I might be more than background noise. Frank chuckled dryly, slapping Dorian's back a little too hard. "Well, isn't that something?" he said, his voice strained into cheerfulness. Claudine clutched her wineglass with white-knuckled hands, her smile pulled too tight across her face. "Of course we always knew Lynn was capable," she offered, the words tasting sour even as she forced them out. Dorian just stood there, blinking as if someone had hit him with a 2x4. His mouth worked silently for a moment before he shook his head and chuckled under his breath, the sound hollow. I said nothing. I didn't need to. Every second that ticked by spoke louder than anything I could have said. Guests began to murmur again, cautiously sipping from their glasses, giving polite smiles, carefully stepping around the invisible wreckage now littering the evening. Still, my parents weren't the type to admit defeat, not even when cornered. Frank approached me about 20 minutes later, while the sky had started bruising into shades of violet and gold, and the fairy lights buzzed overhead. "You know," he began, clapping me lightly on the shoulder like we were old buddies, "your mother and I have been tossing around a little idea. Something small, modest, really." I arched an eyebrow, waiting. "We've been thinking about investing," he continued, his tone casual in a way that made my skin crawl. "Starting a boutique wine label, maybe. Something family-oriented. Wouldn't need much seed money, just a little help to get it off the ground. And who better to support family than... Family?" Claudine appeared at his side like a ghost, her smile syrupy sweet. "Blood is thicker than water, after all," she chirped. "We stick together, don't we, sweetheart?" It took every ounce of discipline I had not to laugh. Not bitterly, not cruelly, but the kind of laugh that comes when you realize a magician's trick is so obvious you can't believe you ever fell for it. "I'll think about it," I said smoothly, draining my glass and setting it on the table with a faint click. That was it. No promises, no invitations for further conversation. Just a cold, clean end to the subject. They didn't push. Not yet. But the desperation in their eyes was loud enough to drown out the buzz of the lights. Later that evening, as twilight gave way to night and the vineyard lights painted everything in a soft, deceptive glow, I heard Claudine's voice carrying across the patio. She stood among a group of guests, a fresh glass of Chardonnay in her hand, laughing that high, practiced laugh she reserved for performances. "Dorian's been considering taking over a vineyard soon," she said breezily, waving her glass as if casually imparting divine truth. "Such a natural fit, really. He's always had the business mind for it. Probably sooner than later." Several heads nodded approvingly. No one looked my way. I stood rooted where I was, watching the scene unfold like an actor trapped in the wrong play. My nails bit into the skin of my palms, hidden discreetly in the folds of my dress. The arrogance, the sheer entitlement. This wasn't just about ignoring my success. This was about rewriting it, claiming it, acting as though my years of blood, sweat, and private victories were nothing more than a footnote to Dorian's inevitable rise. They weren't even subtle. And worse, they didn't even feel shame. I didn't confront her. Not there. Not then. I simply let the anger settle into something heavier, something denser, a decision crystallizing in my bones. No more pretending, no more second chances. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills and the first stars blinked into existence above the vines, I knew the simple, brutal truth. It was me or them, and I was done losing. As the stars shimmered faintly above the vineyard, the evening air cooled, brushing against my skin like a whispered warning. Conversations around the courtyard tried desperately to resume their rhythm, but the undercurrent had shifted. I could feel it in every glance, every stilted laugh. And yet, somewhere deep inside, I felt steady for the first time all evening. I wasn't surprised when Frank found me near one of the trellises, feigning casualness with every stiff movement. He sauntered over, hands in his pockets, wearing that lopsided grin he saved for when he thought he was being charming, or manipulative. "Hey, pumpkin," he began, drawing out the words like we shared some inside joke. "Been thinking, Maybe it's time we make this little venture a real family affair. I folded my arms loosely across my chest, saying nothing. You know, he continued, shifting his weight, might not be a bad idea to get your mother and me listed officially, as co-owners, family trust and all that. Easier tax breaks, too. He winked like he had just shared some grand secret, some brilliant scheme I was lucky to be in on. Claudine wasn't far behind, gliding over with a flute of champagne and a sugary smile. It would show unity, she added, her voice lilting and false. People trust family businesses more when the whole family's involved. They thought they were being subtle. They thought flattery and pressure, sweetened with fake smiles, would coax me into compliance. I met Frank's expectant gaze with an expression so blank it almost hurt to hold. No, I said, voice low, even. Frank blinked. Claudine's hand tightened on her glass, the crystalware creaking ominously under her grip. No discussion? Frank asked, trying to chuckle it off, but his voice cracked at the edges. I shook my head once, slowly. This vineyard is mine. It stays mine. End of discussion. The look that passed between them was fast, but not fast enough for me to miss. A flare of anger, wounded pride, and calculation. Fine, Frank said, the words spat out like a rotten seed. He clapped me a little too hard on the shoulder and walked away, Claudine trailing behind, whispering furiously in his ear. I watched them go, not with sadness, but with a kind of detached inevitability. Later, as the evening limped along, Claudine's voice rose above the crowd once again. Ladies and gentlemen, she called brightly, a quick moment, please. A screen flickered to life near the main terrace, a slideshow rolling through pictures of Dorian. Baby pictures, high school victories, college ceremonies, even corporate headshots that looked suspiciously photoshopped to make him appear taller, broader, more impressive. Slide after slide, memory after memory, but not one included me, not a single one. Around me, murmurs grew. Guests exchanged awkward glances. Some even shifted uncomfortably, stealing glances in my direction before quickly looking away. A few mouthed small apologies with their eyes, but none dared to say anything aloud. I stood still, the glass in my hand tilting slightly. The ache was sharp, surgical, but it didn't split me open the way it might have before. Instead, it crystallized into something cleaner, sharper. Claudine beamed through the entire presentation, as if daring me to react, as if daring me to break. But I didn't. I smiled, small, unshakable, and cold as marble. When the last picture faded into darkness, polite applause broke out, hesitant, obligatory. I set my empty glass down on the nearest table and slipped away from the crowd, heart steady, steps sure. I found Frank and Claudine huddled near the wine-tasting station, laughing too loud at nothing. I approached them quietly, letting my presence press against them like a rising tide. Frank turned first, his grin faltering slightly. "Enjoy the show?" he asked, too loudly. I didn't bother with pleasantries. "If you ever try something like that again," I said, voice low enough only for them to hear, "you'll regret it." They blinked at me, twin masks of confusion poorly worn. "You've been warned," I continued, my tone flat, unyielding. "Push me, and you won't just lose access to this vineyard. You'll lose any place you still have left in my life." Claudine's mouth opened. Some protest, some excuse, but I was already turning away. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to explain. The line had been drawn. Now it was up to them whether they would cross it and face the consequences. I walked away from them without looking back, my heels pressing into the gravel path, each step heavier than the last. The night had turned cooler, the faint scent of ripened grapes mixing with the crispness of approaching autumn. The vineyard lights flickered gently against the deep blue sky, casting everything in a golden haze. As I rounded the corner back toward the main courtyard, a hand brushed my arm lightly. I turned to find one of the older guests, Mrs. Cantrell, a woman my parents always fawned over. Standing there, her mouth pulled into an awkward, sympathetic smile. "You deserve so much better, dear," she said, voice low but carrying enough weight that I saw a few heads nearby tilt, eavesdropping. It wasn't kindness. It was pity. Manufactured pity. I could see the strings attached to her words, the subtle puppetry orchestrated by Frank and Claudine. They hadn't just tried to humiliate me in private. They had sown whispers throughout the party like rotten seeds, ensuring that even strangers would see me not as a woman who had built her success, but as the wounded, overlooked daughter. My fingers itched to clench, but I forced my hand to stay loose, my face neutral. I nodded politely and murmured something vague, slipping away before the tightness in my chest could break through my practiced calm. I didn't owe them a scene. I owed myself my dignity. Inside the tent where the music pulsed low and the wine flowed more freely, Dorian was holding court. He lounged casually against one of the bar stools, surrounded by a few of our more impressionable cousins and some of the Vineyard's newer investors, who clearly hadn't caught up with tonight's drama yet. I was halfway across the room when I caught his voice, too loud, dripping with fake charm. "Good thing Sis had a few bucks to spare back in the day," Dorian laughed, lifting his glass in a mocking toast. "Best donation I ever got. Seriously, without that little loan, who knows where I'd be?" Laughter rippled around the small group, some genuine, some awkward, and a few people glanced at me, their smiles freezing in place when they realized I'd heard every word. Donation. As if the loan I had given him, money scraped together from my first miserable jobs, money he had begged for after crashing and burning at yet another opportunity my parents handed him, was some casual favor, a handout, not a sacrifice. I stood there for a beat too long, feeling the weight of every eye in the room shift toward me, expecting me to laugh it off, to play along, to stay in my place. I didn't. I didn't smile. I didn't raise my glass. I didn't even blink. I simply turned on my heel and walked away, leaving Dorian's punchline hanging limp in the stale air behind me. By the time I made it outside again, I had barely cooled down before Frank decided to make his own grand contribution to the evening's humiliation parade. Standing near the bonfire pit, drink in hand, he was regaling a group of guests with stories about the sacrifices he made for his children. "I could have been a partner at my firm, easy," he said, shaking his head with faux humility. "But no, I chose family, gave it all up to make sure they had what they needed." He chuckled, raising his glass. At least with Dorian, it was worth it. The words struck like tiny, precise blows. Not one mention of me, not one acknowledgement of my years of struggle, the money sent home when bills piled up, the silent support that went unnoticed and unthanked. It would have broken me once. Not tonight. Not anymore. I felt something inside me harden, not brittle, not fragile, but forged. A kind of resolve that didn't need an audience, didn't need recognition. They had chosen their narrative. Now I would choose mine. I didn't storm over. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand to be seen. Instead, I slipped through the party like a ghost, gathering the pieces of myself they had tried so hard to splinter, fitting them back together with a fierce, quiet dignity they would never understand. As I moved past the clusters of whispering guests, past the clinking glasses and artificial laughter, I realized something so clear, so devastatingly simple. The only way they could keep hurting me was if I kept standing in their line of fire, and that was about to change. I moved back toward the courtyard, the buzz of the party washing over me like static. The twilight had deepened into full night, strings of lights overhead casting a soft, falsely warm glow. I spotted Claudine near the dessert table, a cluster of neighbors and distant relatives orbiting her like moths drawn to a flame. She was in her element, smiling too brightly, laughing a shade too loud. As I passed, her voice lifted over the hum of conversation, clear enough for everyone to hear. "Running a vineyard is such a lovely hobby," Claudine said, a sweet poison lacing her words. "But real business? That's for the big players." A few guests chuckled nervously. Some looked at me, then quickly away, their faces folding into polite discomfort. I didn't react. Not a twitch, not a blink. If Claudine expected me to flinch, to shrink down into the role she had assigned me for so many years, the grateful nobody riding on the coattails of the real successes in the family, she was about to be sorely disappointed. Her words slid off me like rain over stone. I had built something real, something enduring, while they clung to illusions. I would not let their pettiness carve holes into the life I had fought for anymore. I moved toward the far end of the patio, where a small platform had been set up, a makeshift stage. It was supposed to be for a light-hearted family toast, a few kind words shared among close friends. Instead, it became a platform for a performance that made the evening curdle in my stomach. Frank stood tall, a wide grin plastered across his face, holding a long, narrow box wrapped in navy paper. Next to him, Dorian preened under the soft applause of a few sycophants. "For our golden boy," Frank announced, his voice booming out across the courtyard. "A little something to remind you of everything still ahead." He pulled the box open with a theatrical flourish, revealing a gleaming Rolex, silver and gold, its face catching the lights like a beacon. The crowd clapped, some out of habit, some because they didn't know what else to do. I stayed where I was, hands loose at my sides, mouth fixed in a neutral line. No one glanced at me for acknowledgement. No one handed me a token of pride. There was no slideshow for me, no gifts, no whispered congratulations for the vineyard whose grounds they now trampled without even a nod to the woman who built it. But the absence didn't hollow me out the way it once might have. It clarified everything. They didn't celebrate me because, deep down, they needed me to stay small, to stay broken, to stay easy to dismiss. Their need didn't have to be my truth anymore. Before the applause had even died down, Frank was back at it again, pulling a thick white envelope from his jacket pocket. He clapped Dorian on the shoulder roughly, almost knocking the watch off his wrist. "And here's a little something to get you started on your next big venture," he barked, loud enough for every curious guest to hear. He shoved the envelope into Dorian's hand. A few nearby guests peered over, eyes widening slightly at the visible bulge of cash. Someone gasped softly. Another person clapped awkwardly. A cousin near the dessert table gave a small, uncomfortable laugh. It wasn't a gift. It was a spectacle. It was a crown placed on the wrong heir's head, a public coronation fueled by denial and desperation. I stood still, drinking in the sight. Every false smile, every sidelong glance, every unspoken judgment hanging in the heavy, humid night air. They thought this would humiliate me. They thought it would shame me into silence, back into my corner. They thought wrong, because standing there amid the forced celebration, I felt something ignite deep within me, not rage exactly, though anger pulsed thick and hot in my blood. It was something colder, sharper, the kind of focus you find when you stop asking for permission to exist. The next move wouldn't be words, it would be action. They wanted a war. They had just declared it, and I would fight it on my terms. The days that followed blurred together. A strange, buzzing quiet settled over the vineyard, interrupted only by the mechanical routines of harvest and the occasional phone call I was too tired to answer. It was a Tuesday morning when the letter came. A thick, official envelope, stamped from the Superior Court of Napa County. My heart didn't skip or race. It simply sank, as if it had known this was coming. I sat alone at the long oak table in my kitchen, the vineyard stretching out just beyond the wide windows, golden under the mid-morning sun. My coffee went cold as I broke the seal. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Petition for guardianship, filed by my parents, claiming I was mentally unstable, claiming I was incapable of managing my own affairs, claiming, laughably, cruelly, that I needed protection. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, the edges of the paper blurred, but I blinked hard, forcing everything back into focus. This was it, the final card they had to play, and they had played it dirty. I set the letter down with careful precision, the way you might set down a viper you found coiled in your hands. Then I stood up, reached for my phone, and called my attorney. No tears, no begging, just a steely, razor-edged calm. The day of the hearing came faster than I expected. I wore black. Not out of mourning, there was nothing left to grieve, but out of a cold, quiet defiance. The courtroom was sterile, the air thick with tension. Rows of polished benches stretched out behind me, filled with a scattering of acquaintances and nosy locals who had caught wind of the scandal. Frank and Claudine sat at the petitioner's table, all fake concern and martyrdom. Claudine clutched a tissue theatrically, dabbing dry eyes. Frank wore a dark suit that strained across his gut, his mouth set in a grim paternal line. I took my seat at the respondent's table, my attorney beside me, a sharp, unflinching woman named Meredith, whose calm professionalism was a balm against the venom leaking from across the aisle. When the judge, a silver-haired woman with piercing eyes, called the session to order, the room seemed to hold its breath. Frank was the first to speak. He painted a picture of a daughter too fragile to manage her affairs, prone to emotional instability, at risk of being taken advantage of. He spoke of concern and love, words that curdled in my stomach the second they left his mouth. Claudine followed, voice trembling just enough to sell the performance, describing me as isolated, erratic, in need of support. I said nothing, not yet. When my turn came, I rose slowly. Not rushed, not defensive. I opened a folder I had prepared and handed copies to the judge to opposing counsel. Bank statements, text message threads, emails, years' worth of documentation, proof of loans I had made to them, loans they had never repaid, loans they had pretended were gifts while privately mocking my generosity, proof of their attempts to siphon money under false pretenses, fake business ventures, medical emergencies that never existed, phantom debts owed to imaginary creditors, and more, screenshots of Claudine bragging to a friend about tricking Lynn into footing the bill again, Frank joking about how the dumb one finally paid off. There was an audible gasp from the back of the room. The judge's face hardened. Opposing counsel tried to object, but it was weak, flailing. Meredith was ready. She tore their argument apart systematically, citing case law, presenting affidavits from former employees who had witnessed years of emotional manipulation. Frank blustered. Claudine sniffled. But the mask had cracked, and underneath was something rotten and obvious. The judge recessed briefly. When she returned, her verdict was swift, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a scalpel. Petition for guardianship is hereby denied. The court finds no evidence to support claims of incompetence. Furthermore, the petitioner's conduct raises serious concerns regarding financial exploitation and emotional abuse. The gavel came down with a satisfying finality. It was done. I stood, smoothing my jacket, turning to face the courtroom, and more importantly, to face them. Frank looked thunderstruck. Claudine had gone sheet white, the tissue in her hand crumpled beyond use. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I simply said, clearly, for all to hear, "You don't own me. You never did." Then I turned and walked out. The sunlight outside was blinding after the sterile dimness of the courtroom. I paused at the top of the courthouse steps, letting it wash over me. It felt like shedding a second skin, one stitched together with shame and duty and invisible bruises. I was free. Not because they gave me permission, because I took it. The courthouse doors swung closed behind me with a final thud that echoed louder in my chest than it did in the air. I didn't look back. Not once. Outside, life moved on without a second glance at the battle I had just fought. Cars honked, pedestrians crossed streets. Somewhere down the block, a street musician was playing a lazy guitar tune that didn't quite match the storm still slowly calming inside me. Word of the trial spread faster than I expected. Napa Valley wasn't a small town, but news like this, the kind you didn't print on invitations, had a way of rippling through the vineyards and dinner parties. Some old family friends, perhaps out of habit or discomfort, clung to the old script. I overheard whispers at a local cafe. Dorian's doing so well. Such a bright future ahead of him. I sipped my coffee and stared out the window, the comments sliding off me like rain off a freshly waxed car. They didn't know. They didn't want to know. It was easier to cling to the golden boy image, to pretend the cracks weren't there. And that was fine. Some people choose blindness because it's safer than facing the truth. I wouldn't waste another breath trying to peel their eyelids open. Later that evening, as the sunset bled over the hills in molten orange and purple, my phone buzzed. A message from Claudine. "Let's move past all this, honey. It's just family drama. Nothing worth ruining relationships over. We still love you." I stared at the words for a long moment, feeling a sadness deeper than anger could ever reach, still pretending, still minimizing, as if dragging me into court, smearing my name, Trying to steal my freedom had been nothing more than a kitchen table squabble over burned Thanksgiving turkey. I didn't reply. Some silences were louder than any response. I let the message hang there in my inbox, unopened again after reading, a digital gravestone for a relationship long dead. The final blow came a few days later. Scrolling absent-mindedly through social media, I stumbled upon a public post Dorian had made. Some people just can't handle success, so they invent fake stories to tear everyone down. Family embarrassment, sad really. There it was, in black and white, no tags, no names, but everyone would know. Everyone already knew. For a moment the screen blurred as tears threatened, not because his words hurt in the way he intended, but because they confirmed, beyond any last shred of denial, that there was no going back. I closed the app. I blocked him. I set the phone down and folded my arms on the table, laying my head down for a few long, shaking breaths. Grief and fury wrestled in my chest, hot and sharp. But they didn't win. I sat up, exhaling slowly. They could throw words like knives all they wanted. I was no longer standing in their line of fire. One afternoon, about a week after the court case, I found myself wandering out into the vineyard. The sun was low, washing the rows of grapevines in a honeyed glow. I sat down on a weathered wooden bench near the edge of the property, the same spot where, years ago, I had dreamed wild dreams of success, of belonging, of being enough. The wind stirred the vines softly, a low whisper of a song only I could hear. Healing wasn't a clean, straight path. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't triumphant marches and sweeping speeches. It was sitting with the hurt. It was letting the silence answer questions you'd stopped daring to ask. It was understanding that some scars don't ever vanish, but they stop hurting the same way. I didn't have the perfect family. I didn't have public vindication. But I had peace. I had my vineyard. I had a future that belonged to no one but me. And that was enough. As the sky darkened into deep blues and purples, I tilted my face up toward the first shy stars peeking through. Some storms don't clear the sky, but they clear the path. And for the first time in my life, the road ahead was mine alone. After everything, if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. You are not obligated to keep toxic people in your life, even if they share your blood. Family isn't defined by who raised you or whose name you carry. It's defined by respect, trust, and love. And if those things are missing, you have every right to walk away. No apologies needed. Freedom doesn't always look like a victory parade. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's lonely. But it's always worth it. I fought for my dignity. I fought for my peace. And standing here now, I can tell you, it was the best decision I ever made. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose yourself over someone you loved? Do you believe blood should automatically equal loyalty? Why or why not? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to hear your story. And hey, if this story touched your heart even a little bit, if you felt seen or understood, please hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. Leave a 1-inch in the comments if you believe in choosing yourself. Let me know where you're watching from. And if this story wasn't quite your cup of tea, tell me why. Your feedback matters, and I want to create stories that truly resonate with you. Thank you for being here. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and most importantly, stay true to yourself.